Okay, so the neighbor started mowing, and I'm going to try to get this in before he comes closer to my side, and hopefully it won't be too loud. Anyway, go ahead and do as much as I can. Hi, and welcome to faerireads, where I talk about things that make the mundane more magical, namely books. So today we're talking about the books that I read in the month of July. The first book I finished was on audio, and it was The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein. This is a book about a woman who works as a trauma cleaner, which was new to me. A trauma cleaner is a cleaner who accepts the jobs that most normal cleaners wouldn't. So it's very industrial cleaning for very traumatic events. They clean up biohazardous material like medical waste. They're called in for hoarding situations, things like that, which again, I didn't know that existed, but I'm really glad that it does. And now I have so much respect for people who are in that profession. This story was very poignant to me. I'm sort of partial to stories about cleaners because my mom worked as a cleaner for most of my life, most of my childhood and adolescence, and so I just feel I have so much respect for janitors, custodians, things like that, or just anyone who does jobs that other people don't want to do. I have so much respect for them. But hearing about this particular person's story, so this Sarah Krasnostein is more of the interviewer. So Sarah tells the story of her friend Sandra, who is the trauma cleaner, and she has obviously spent a lot of time with Sandra going on jobs and things like that, but she interviews Sandra about her childhood and all the events that led her into this profession of trauma cleaning. So you learned Sandra's backstory, which is pretty horrific, to be honest. She's a trans woman, and she grew up in a very abusive household, and she just dealt with a lot of hardships, but you can tell that those hardships are what allow her to be so compassionate to the people that she works with, to her clients who have obviously been through trauma. And that's part of why she's there. It's trauma cleaning. It's her job to help clean up and pick up the pieces in the aftermath of everything. And it just was so profound to me to hear her speak about these people. And I gather that she's not really a religious person, which is fine. I mean, totally respect that, but the way she talks about her job is almost as if it's a vocation for her. And so a vocation is like your spiritual calling. A vocation being a more sacred version of a job. It's not just a paycheck. It's something that's very special and meaningful to her. And it was just so inspiring, like that. We should all strive to be like Sandra in that way, and I recommend the book to anyone and everyone. I feel like everyone can learn from it, because we all need to have a little bit more compassion and healing for each other. So I loved The Trauma Cleaner, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book I finished was Daring and the Duke by Sarah MacClean. This is the 3rd book in her trilogy, The Bare Knuckle Bastards, and it's a romance. It's more of a second chance romance, and it kind of has the hate to love trope, because at the beginning they have a very troubled history and their relationship broke off on a bad note. And it's one of those things, that happen in series, especially in romance series, where background characters in previous books finally get their own book. So the premise of the series is basically that this Duke he was just a terrible person, to be honest, but of course his purpose in life, as for most dukes, was to reproduce and get an heir. And of course, he's married, but he's unfaithful to his wife, and he ends up having 3 bastard sons, as in illegitimate, and he also, with his married wife, has a daughter, and they're all born on the same day, which is wild. And so basically he has no legitimate heir because his only daughter cannot inherit because she's a woman, and his sons are illegitimate because their mother was not married to him. So he has them basically fight each other for the title, and it's pretty awful, and he raises them in awful ways. But anyway, so they all grow up with their own individual traumas and everything, and the first 2 books are about the other 2 brothers, and this is the final book. It centers on the brother who ended up winning the heir, or winning the title, and his story and his romance, which is actually with, I guess I'll go ahead and say in case it wears anybody out, it's actually with their sister. But no, they're not blood related because, again, oh yeah, because she was actually a bastard too. She was not the Duke's son or daughter. I'm getting so confused in telling it. There's no blood relation, okay? So just to quell that thought. It's still pretty weird though, but I really liked their relationship because it has a lot of angst because of their history, and they come into it already emotionally charged, and it all makes sense because of their circumstances. But it was just really well done. I was looking forward to this relationship the most out of all of the series, and so I went in with pretty high expectations, and I really wasn't that disappointed, so I gave it 5 stars. The next book I finished, I listened to on audio, and it was Legendary Children by Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez. This is a book detailing queer history, especially contextualized around the show RuPaul's Drag Race. So I was interested in this because I don't know much about queer history, and I have watched Drag Race before. I think I stopped at about season 5 or 6. Wherever Hulu stops, or at least where it stopped at the time. I may have more seasons on now, but I think it was about season 5 or 6 when I stopped watching. But I do enjoy the show a lot. I think it's very funny, and I love the creativity and just the performances of everyone on the program. But I don't know a lot of the history, and being that I'm not part of the queer community, a lot of the culture, a lot of the practices, I guess, I don't fully understand, and I wanted to learn more about. So that's why I listened to it. So it talks about a lot of different figures from queer history, and I was really surprised at how much Arkansas is referenced. So apparently I need to learn a lot more about the herstory here in Arkansas because it played a bigger role than I thought. And apparently there's more queer activism and queer history here than I realized. So I'm intrigued to continue learning about that. And I also learned more about the practice or the art of reading somebody. And this was something that, you know, in watching RuPaul and other shows, something about queer culture that kind of made me uncertain of it because it seemed very mean-spirited, and, you know, it was just something, because of my core beliefs, it was something that I'm not sure that I fully support. And reading more of the history, I feel like I understand that practice better. Apparently it comes from a history of being, you know, being threatened on the streets just for existing and being who they are. So it's very much a defense mechanism and very much a survival tactic. So I have more respect and understanding for it in that way. Still debating within myself as to whether that makes it okay or not. Is it okay to be mean to somebody just because they're being mean to you? I don't know. I guess we all have to make those decisions for ourselves. But I'm really glad that I read it for learning that and so many other things. So I really liked it, and I gave it 3 stars. Okay, so the next book, I don't even know if I want to talk about it, but I will, for full disclosure, sake of honesty. I ended up buying a ebook called Stealing Cinderella by A. Zavarelli. I had read this author before. She has a series where she does like mafia romances, which it kind of sounds silly just to say it out loud. But I like the mafia romances because, like I've said before, I like the angsty kind of troubled relationships. And those relationships only make sense in very like specific circumstances. And, you know, I don't mind if a hero in a romance starts out being a bit of a jerk, especially if there is a comeuppance and there's character growth and you see him, you know, change and repent in the story, which doesn't always happen. But I feel like the mafia setting sort of justifies a lot of those tropes and justifies him being that way. It's like, well, of course he's going to be a bit of a jerk because he's a criminal, because, well, he really is a bad person. And, you know, not that those things are okay in real life. It's just fun for me to explore in fiction. So, having liked some of her books before, and most of her books are kind of dark, and I put that in air quotes because, you know, what's dark to one person may not be so dark to another person, but they're very, you know, not the, you know, happy clappy feel good kind of romance stories. They deal with a lot of real world dark issues. So the premise of Stealing Cinderella is that it is a dark fairy tale retelling of Cinderella. And if you know me, you know I love fairy tales. I love fairy tale retelling, so I was interested to see her take on the Cinderella story. And overall, I was pretty disappointed. Mostly, I didn't connect with the Cinderella character so much. I felt she was a little flat and a little bit too kind. And I know that's sort of true to her character. Like, that is, you know, she is too kind to her stepmother and her step siblings and her sisters, and, you know, she bears all the abuse with a smile, like that sort of thing. But it just seemed to go a little bit too far for me, and that it was harder for me to empathize with her in that way. And also just the crux of her relationship with her Prince Charming, who is a Scandinavian prince. I think he's the Prince of Norway, and I forgot his name, to be honest. But their relationship, you know, it's, as you read the book, you find that he has a troubled past, and so does she, and they're supposed to find, you know, relate to each other in that way and find healing in the relationship. But it just didn't make sense to me. It didn't feel real to me. It didn't connect with me on an emotional level, and most of the scenes just weren't to my taste, and it just, yeah, it fell flat. And I feel like some of the messages are kind of damaging. Definitely trigger warning for suicide, suicidal thoughts, for abuse, for... There's probably a lot that I'm not even thinking of right now, but that's definitely one to check the trigger warnings for if you have any concern for that. So, but I did like it enough to finish. I did care enough to know how it ended, so I ended up giving it 2 stars. The next book I finished was Cursed by Thomas Wheeler, which is illustrated by Frank Miller, and this is one that I read in anticipation of the release of the Netflix adaptation. I'm not going to speak much about this because I've already uploaded a video talking about the book and the Netflix series and my opinions and thoughts on that, so I will link that, and if you want to go check that out and find out more about what I think there. But I will say that I gave it 3 stars. The next book I finished was another audiobook called Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. This is my 3rd book to have read by Samantha Irby, and after reading this book, it has solidified her spot in my list of favorite authors. I think she's hilarious. I want to be friends with her in real life. She does essays about real life, basically, and, you know, it's really interesting for me to read her perspective, because she is a Black woman, she's queer, she lives in Michigan now, I think, and she writes about that a lot in this book because that's a more recent change. She moved to be with her wife in either Michigan or Minnesota. I may be getting them confused, but she's just hilarious and clever and witty, and I love listening to her essays. I didn't like this one as much as I like some other ones. I remember laughing a lot harder in some of the stories in the previous books, so that's the only reason. So I did end up knocking my rating down for this book a little bit lower compared to previous books by her because I liked those books just a little bit more. So I only gave it 4 stars, but she's still a definite favorite author. If you haven't read Samantha Irby, I think this book is a great place to start, and if you like that, you will like some of her previous work even more. The next book I finished was The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Michele Richardson. This was a book that I had seen on BookTube, like right around the time that I started filming on my own channel, or filming my own videos, and to be honest, I don't remember whose channel it was, but I remember watching somebody review it in a wrap-up, and they said they really liked it, and it was in their review that I learned about the Blue people of Appalachia, and that this was a real medical phenomenon that happened particularly in Kentucky, but I'm sure there are cases in other parts of the world. But I was really I'm drawn to Appalachia as a region because of my family and my, you know, my heritage, I guess. I've mentioned before, I live in Arkansas, and I live in central Arkansas, and it's very suburban here. I've led a very suburban life, and I was born in central Arkansas, but my family is from the Ozarks, which is kind of northwest Arkansas, and the region goes into Missouri, and my family's from the Arkansas side, and we're just kind of hill folk, kind of hillbilly culture. But even though the Ozarks are a very isolated and very rural, very considered backward in a lot of ways, and that's probably a fair statement, I still am proud of my heritage, and I do firmly believe that everyone should be proud of where they come from. No one should feel shame for being born in a specific place that they have no control over. And I just have a lot of sympathy especially for people who come from places that are looked down upon, and they're kind of seen as the underdog, I guess. I guess that's the draw of it, is you're rooting for the underdog, for the people who are ignored and disadvantaged. So that's part of why I was drawn to this story, because the Appalachians and the Ozarks have a lot of traits in common. And in my own family history, the family settled in the Appalachian region before moving further west to Arkansas. But so that part kind of appealed to the story, or appealed me to the story. The premise of the story is that the bookwoman, the titular character, is a lady in Kentucky who is a blue person who has the medical condition where the pigment of her skin is blue because it has to do with the hemoglobin. I think it's all explained in the book, and I'm sure I can link somewhere that will explain it better than me just off the top of my head. It's about her experience as being a bookwoman, which was a real program in the 30s, started by Roosevelt, and it's a way to help improve rural education in these isolated areas that were so difficult to get books and, well, anything to. So she's a bookwoman, she delivers books on horseback, you know, throughout the hills, but she also, so it's dealing with that, her struggles of being single in the 30s at that time. You know, being a single woman was very much, you know, frowned upon. And so her struggles in her romantic life, as, you know, how can you find a husband as a blue woman? Can you find someone that will actually love and respect you and not see you as a burden? Things like that. And also dealing with the prejudice that she faces because she's technically considered colored, even though she has, you know, like a Anglican English, you know, Anglo-European history. Her skin is still pigmented, and she still is not allowed in white-only spaces in her town. So it was a really interesting perspective to read, and it also had an emotional attachment to me because my grandparents both passed away within the past year, and they were alive during that time, so it was interesting for me to read about daily life in that time, because the way it's described in the book is probably similar to a lot of the things that my grandparents experienced when they were in their childhood. So it's a book that has a lot of appeal to me as a person, but it's still a very good story. I think if you didn't have those attachments, you'd still really enjoy it. And you get to learn more about this, you know, very interesting medical condition, and, you know, relive that very interesting part of American history, you know, during Reconstruction and trying to pick up the pieces after the Great Depression. So I really liked it. I loved it. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I finished was The Merry Spinster by Mallory Ortberg. This was actually a reread for me. I read it the first time back in April or May. I think it was back in April. I attempted to do a 24-hour reading vlog, which never survived to see the light of day, but I did do a lot of reading. I actually did read in that time. The vlog just never happened, and The Merry Spinster was one of the books that I read. It's a collection of fairy tale retellings mostly. They're basically retellings of old stories that shaped a lot of our childhoods, and there's a very unexpected twist put on all of them. So I reread this book actually to make a video about it, and I have the footage sitting around waiting to be edited. I actually have a lot to say about it, so maybe some videos about it will be coming soon, so I won't say much here. I will say I kept the same rating as I rated it the first time around, which is 5 stars, because it is amazing. The last book I finished was Westside by W.M. Akers. This is another story set in either the 20s or the 30s. I think it's the 1920s in New York, but this is a alternate dimension New York, where the west side of New York is sort of this cursed land, or maybe a sort of liminal space where things tend to go wrong, things start disappearing. And so because of all of the unexpected goings on in the west side, it is walled off from the east side. And we follow the story of our protagonist, who is a girl who works as a detective solving what she calls little mysteries. So she doesn't solve like extremely complicated, large-scale mysteries like murder or, you know, mafia robberies, anything like that. But she investigates little mysteries like things that are lost. And at the beginning of the book, we are following her as she takes on a client who's looking to recover a missing glove. And in pursuing that glove, she gets drawn into a lot of, you know, political machinations and very mysterious, magical goings on in the city. I really liked the novel. I liked the premise of it a lot, and I liked our main character. I felt very sympathetic toward her, but I struggled with finishing it. After that 75% mark, I really struggled to finish. I think this is mostly due to personal goings on. I had a hard time focusing because of things that were going on. But I did manage to push through, and I finished this like on July 31st. Like, I was determined to finish it by the end of the month. And it is good. It's fast-paced, it's action-packed, but I think it was just lacking a little, I don't know, something to really push me forward in the story. There is a sequel, which I think has released by now, or it's about to release this fall. I'm not sure that I will be reading it right away, but I probably will get around to it eventually because I am intrigued to know more about this world. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. And that's a wrap on my July wrap up. Hopefully you could hear this even though there was mowing going on in the background, but we did succeed in finishing before he was like mowing outside my window, so that's good. If you've read any of these books or if you have any comments on them, I'd love to hear from you down below. And thanks for watching. Bye.